Shadows of the past Everett. Pierce stared through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching Seattle's skyline shimmer against the morning rain. At 38, he'd built Pierce Technologies into a $12 billion empire, yet the rain-washed city below felt as distant as the stars. His reflection gazed back at him. Tailored charcoal suit, precisely trimmed beard covering a jaw that rarely softened, and eyes that his executive board had once described as calculating to the point of mathematical. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Pierce, your 9 o'clock is here, the new assistant candidate. Send her in," he replied, not bothering to turn around. Behind him, the door opened with a soft click. He let the silence stretch, a small test he administered to everyone. Most people filled uncomfortable silences with nervous chatter. The truly confident ones waited. This one waited. Finally, Everett turned. The woman standing by his desk was tall and poised, with warm brown skin and hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her navy blue suit was modest but well-tailored, and she met his gaze directly. Professional, not intimidated, but not challenging either. "Nora Winters," she said, extending her hand. "Thank you for considering me." Her handshake was firm. He gestured to the chair across from his desk and sat down himself. "Your resume is impressive," Everett said, tapping the tablet in front of him. "Northwestern University, double major in business administration and computer science, top of your class, 3 years at Goldman Sachs, then 2 at Tesla. Excellent recommendations. What I don't understand is why you'd leave Tesla for a personal assistant position." Nora placed her portfolio on her lap. "I value directness, Mr. Pierce. So I'll be direct. Tesla was offering advancement, but in a direction that would have meant relocating to Austin. I need to remain in Seattle for personal reasons. Your position offers comparable compensation with the location I require." Everett raised an eyebrow. Most candidates tried to convince him how passionately they wanted to work for his visionary leadership. Her pragmatism was refreshing. "The role requires absolute discretion and availability," he said. "My last 3 assistants quit within months." "I'm aware of your reputation," Nora replied, a hint of something, amusement, flickering in her eyes. "You require perfection, privacy, and someone who doesn't take things personally. I can provide all 3. Everett leaned back, studying her. There was something unreadable about her, a quiet depth that intrigued him professionally. "The job is yours if you want it. You can start tomorrow." "Thank you. I'll be here at 7. The interview was clearly over, but Everett found himself asking one more question. "Your file mentioned community service, a memory care facility?" For the briefest moment, something vulnerable crossed her face before disappearing behind professional composure. "Golden Years Memory Care. I volunteer there weekends." "Admirable," he said, though charity work had always struck him as sentimental inefficiency. After his ex-fiancée, Vanessa, had left him for his then business partner 15 years ago, taking their startup's prototype and investor connections with her, Everett had learned that sentiment was weakness. He'd rebuilt from nothing with that lesson etched into every decision. Trust the numbers, not people. Systems, not emotions. The next morning, Nora arrived at 6:45. By 9, she had reorganized his calendar, drafted 3 response letters he'd been avoiding, and presented him with a more efficient system for prioritizing his daily tasks. By the end of the week, Everett realized she was the most competent assistant he'd ever had. She anticipated his needs, managed difficult clients with diplomatic precision, and never once brought personal matters into the workplace. What he couldn't know, was that each evening, Nora drove her 15-year-old Honda to Golden Years Memory Care, where she sat beside an elegant silver-haired woman who sometimes recognized her and sometimes thought she was a nurse. On those evenings, Nora would read from dog-eared poetry books, manage medical bills that grew increasingly impossible, and whisper promises that somehow she would find a way to keep her grandmother in the facility's experimental treatment program that insurance wouldn't cover. And on those same evenings, Everett Pierce would return to his empty penthouse, pour a single glass of scotch, and review acquisition projections until the numbers blurred before his eyes. Never questioning why success felt so hollow, or why the rain against his window sounded so much like loneliness. Paper walls 3 months into Nora's employment, Everett found himself unconsciously tracking the soft click of her heels against marble as she moved through the office. Her efficiency had become something he relied on, a constancy in his otherwise shifting world of acquisitions and competitors. "The Thompson deal projections," Nora said, placing a folder on his desk one Tuesday morning. "And I've arranged for the dinner with the Japanese investors on Thursday at Canlis. Private room as you prefer." Everett nodded, opening the folder. "You've included the alternative market analysis I mentioned." Of course. There was never pride in her voice when she completed tasks perfectly, just quiet competence that expected nothing, not even recognition. He glanced up to find her checking her watch, a subtle movement most wouldn't notice, but Everett had built his fortune noticing what others missed. "Somewhere to be?" he asked. "No," she answered smoothly. "I was just confirming we have 20 minutes before your call with the board." Everett leaned back in his chair, studying her. After 3 months, he realized he knew almost nothing about her beyond her impeccable work. Most people revealed themselves in small ways: photos on desks, personal calls, complaints about traffic or weather. Nora kept her life wrapped in paper walls, as carefully constructed as his own. "Tell me something," he said, surprising himself. "Do you ever regret leaving investment banking for this job?" Something flickered across her face. Caution, perhaps. "No. This position suits my needs." "Which are?" "Stability, Mr. Pierce, and proximity to my family." It was the most personal thing she'd ever shared, and somehow he knew it hadn't been offered lightly. Before he could inquire further, his phone rang with the board call, and the moment dissolved. Later that week, Everett found himself working late. The office had emptied hours ago, but the Thompson acquisition was proving more complex than anticipated. He rubbed his eyes, standing to stretch his cramping muscles, when he noticed a light still on in Nora's office. He walked over, prepared to commend her dedication, when he saw her hunched over her desk, not working but staring at her computer screen with such naked worry that he paused in the doorway. On her screen was a medical bill, $178, $540 marked, "Past due final notice." Nora sensed his presence and quickly closed the window, composing her features into professional neutrality. "Mr. Pierce, I didn't realize you were still here." "Problem?" he asked, gesturing vaguely toward her computer. "Nothing that concerns work," she answered, gathering papers. "The Thompson projections look promising. Their R&D department has patents we could leverage immediately." Her deflection was smooth, but something about the amount on that bill stayed with him. He recognized the header, Golden Years Memory Care, the place she'd mentioned volunteering. "You should head home," he said, surprising himself with the consideration. "The acquisition will wait until morning." Relief flickered across her face. "Thank you. I'll be in early tomorrow to prepare for the board presentation." As she gathered her things, Everett noticed how carefully she checked her phone, the tight line of her shoulders betraying tension that her face wouldn't show. The next day brought a crisis with the Thompson deal. A competitor had made a surprise counteroffer, and Everett spent hours in heated negotiations. Through it all, Nora was flawless, anticipating needs, providing crucial information at exactly the right moment, managing the chaos with unflappable calm. It was past midnight when they finally secured the deal. The executive team celebrated with expensive champagne in the conference room, but Everett noticed Nora slipping away after coordinating the catering. "Winters," he called, catching her at the elevator. "Good work today." She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes, the first he'd seen. "Thank you, Mr. Pierce. You're not joining the celebration." Her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her purse. "I need to make a stop before visiting hours end." The elevator arrived and she stepped in. As the doors closed, Everett was left with the unsettling feeling that he'd glimpsed something significant, a corner of a much larger picture he couldn't yet see. The following weeks brought a rhythm to their work relationship. Everett found himself speaking more to Nora than to anyone else, their conversations efficient but increasingly comfortable. Sometimes when they worked late, he'd notice her checking her phone with that same worried expression before masking it quickly. One evening, as Seattle's perpetual rain drummed against the windows, Everett found himself asking, "Why the memory care facility?" Nora looked up from the report she was reviewing, surprise evident. For a moment he thought she might deflect, but instead, she set down her pen. "My grandmother raised me after my parents died," she said quietly. "She has early onset Alzheimer's. 3 years ago she began forgetting things. Small at first, then bigger. Now she's in an experimental treatment program." "That's what the bill was for," Everett said, the pieces connecting. Nora's expression closed immediately. "I apologize for handling personal matters at work." "No apology needed," he said, uncomfortable with her discomfort. "Family obligations are understandable." That night, lying awake in his penthouse, Everett found himself thinking about Nora's grandmother. He'd been alone so long he'd forgotten what it meant to be responsible for someone else's well-being. His own parents had been distant figures who'd left him a modest inheritance and little else. After Vanessa's betrayal, he'd cut every tie that might become a vulnerability. Yet here was Nora, shouldering an impossible burden without complaint, never using it as an excuse, never seeking sympathy. For the first time in years, Everett felt something uncomfortable shift inside him, a recognition that perhaps his carefully constructed worldview had blind spots. The next morning, he caught himself watching Nora as she efficiently organized his day. There was a grace to her movements, a quiet dignity in how she carried her burdens unseen. It reminded him strangely of watching his mother tend roses in their small garden years ago. Careful, patient work that required both strength and gentleness. The thought disturbed him enough that he buried himself in acquisition reports for the rest of the day, refusing to acknowledge the growing curiosity about the woman who managed his life with such precision, while her own appeared to be unraveling in ways she wouldn't share. Unexpected intersection. The quarterly investors' meeting had gone exceptionally well. Pierce Technologies stock had jumped 12% after Everett announced the successful integration of Thomson's patents, and the board was practically euphoric. Even Everett allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction as he loosened his tie in the elevator heading down to the parking garage. It was nearly 9 in the evening, and the building had emptied hours ago. Nora had left precisely at 5, the first time in months she'd departed on schedule. She'd mentioned needing to attend to something important, her request for punctual departure so unusual that Everett had simply nodded his approval. The garage was silent, except for the echo of his footsteps as he approached his Aston Martin. He was reaching for his keys when his phone vibrated with a text from his CFO about celebrating the successful presentation. Everett declined politely. Celebrations held no appeal. They were merely performative rituals that wasted valuable time. 20 minutes later, he was driving through the winding streets of Queen Anne Hill when his navigation system alerted him to an accident ahead. Rerouting took him down an unfamiliar street lined with medical facilities. At a red light, he glanced idly at the building to his right, Golden Years Memory Care, its modern facade softly lit against the evening sky. Everett's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. This was where Nora volunteered, where her grandmother received treatment. The light turned green, but instead of continuing home, he found himself pulling into the visitor parking lot, a decision he couldn't entirely explain even to himself. He sat in his car for several minutes, questioning his own motives. Professional concern? Idle curiosity? Neither seemed adequate. Eventually, he stepped out into the cool evening air, telling himself he would simply inquire about their experimental treatment program, purely for informational purposes. The reception area was warmly lit, with comfortable seating and walls, displaying artwork clearly created by residents. A young receptionist looked up with professional cheerfulness. "Good evening. Visiting hours end at 9, but you're welcome to sign in." "I'm not here to visit," Everett said. "I'm interested in learning about your experimental treatment program for Alzheimer's." The receptionist brightened. "Of course. Our memory restoration therapy has shown promising results. Dr. Harlow leads the program. She's actually hosting a small gathering in the garden room right now where some families are sharing their experiences. You're welcome to observe if you'd like to learn more. Before Everett could decline, she was already leading him down a hallway. It's just through here. They're celebrating a milestone tonight. One of our patients has shown significant improvement after 6 months in the program. She opened a door to a bright room with large windows overlooking a garden illuminated by string lights. About 20 people stood in small groups, holding glasses of sparkling cider. Everett was about to retreat when he saw her. Nora stood near the windows, her arm linked with an elegant older woman whose silver hair was styled in a sophisticated bob. The older woman was speaking animatedly to a doctor in a white coat, gesturing with her free hand. What struck Everett most was Nora's expression, a mixture of joy and relieved exhaustion, so naked, so unguarded, that he felt like an intruder, witnessing something deeply private. He turned to leave, but at that moment Nora looked up. Their eyes met across the room, and he watched recognition, then shock, then something like embarrassment wash across her face. She said something to her grandmother and made her way toward him. "Mr. Pierce," she said, her professional mask sliding back into place, though not completely. "This is unexpected." "I was passing by," he said, the explanation sounding hollow, even to himself. "I remembered you mentioned this facility." Nora studied him, clearly trying to reconcile his presence with everything she knew about him. "Were you looking for me? Is there an issue with the Thompson integration?" "No," he admitted. "I was curious about the treatment program." Something in her expression softened slightly. "Would you like to meet my grandmother? Tonight is special. She recognized me immediately this morning. First time in months." Before he could formulate a reason to decline, Nora was guiding him across the room to where her grandmother stood speaking with the doctor. "Grandma, this is Mr. Pierce, my employer," Nora said. The older woman turned, her eyes bright with intelligence and warmth. "Ah, the famous Mr. Pierce. Nora speaks very highly of your business acumen, though she says you could use more plants. In your office. Living things improve cognitive function, you know." "Grandma?" Nora whispered, mortified. Everett found himself smiling, actually smiling. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Winters." "Josephine, please. Mrs. Winters was my mother-in-law, and she was a terrible cook." She patted his arm with surprising familiarity. "Thank you for giving my granddaughter flexible hours. These treatments require such precise timing." Everett glanced at Nora, whose cheeks had colored slightly. He hadn't given her flexible hours. She'd simply managed everything so efficiently, he never noticed her occasional absences. Dr. Harlow joined their conversation, explaining the treatment protocol with evident passion. "Josephine has been one of our star participants. The combination of cognitive exercises, targeted medication, and neural stimulation has shown remarkable results." "And the cost?" Everett asked before he could stop himself. The doctor hesitated. "It's experimental, so insurance doesn't cover it yet. We're working to change that as we document outcomes." "Worth every penny," Josephine declared, squeezing Nora's hand. "Though my stubborn granddaughter works too hard to pay for it. I tell her to find a nice rich man to marry, but she insists on independence." "Grandma." Nora's embarrassment was complete now. Josephine laughed, the sound bright and musical. "I'm teasing, dear, mostly." She turned back to Everett. "My Nora was always the serious one. Straight A's, perfect attendance, never a moment wasted. Even as a child, she carried the weight of the world so quietly no one noticed until they saw her standing straight while others would have crumbled." Everett looked at Nora, really looked at her, seeing beyond the efficient assistant to the woman who had been fighting an impossible battle with grace and dignity. Something uncomfortable twisted in his chest, recognition perhaps of a kindred spirit who had also built walls for protection, though for entirely different reasons. Later, as he prepared to leave, Nora walked him to his car. "I apologize for my grandmother's forwardness," she said. "The treatments affect her filter sometimes." "No apology needed," Everett replied. "She's remarkable, as are you." Nora looked up, startled by the personal nature of the comment. I should have mentioned the occasional absences, she said. It won't affect my work performance. I know. He hesitated, then added, the treatment seems promising. It is. Her voice softened. Tonight was the first time in months she remembered my birthday without prompting. The simple statement hung in the cool evening air between them. Her birthday. Today was Nora's birthday, and she'd spent it working tirelessly at his side through the investor meeting before rushing here to celebrate a moment of clarity with her grandmother. Happy birthday, Nora, he said quietly, her first name feeling strange on his tongue after months of professional formality. She smiled, a real smile that transformed her face. Thank you, Mr. Pierce. Everett, he corrected, surprising himself. Outside the office, at least. As he drove home, the Seattle skyline glittering against the night sky, Everett found himself turning over the evening's revelations. For years, he'd built his life around the certainty that vulnerability was weakness, that emotional connections were liabilities. Yet tonight, he'd witnessed Nora's love for her grandmother, a connection that clearly brought both pain and profound joy, and recognized it not as weakness, but as a different kind of strength than the one he'd cultivated. The realization was as uncomfortable as it was unavoidable. Perhaps he had been wrong all these years. Perhaps he had mistaken isolation for strength, mistaken invulnerability for power. Perhaps in cutting himself off from the possibility of pain, he had also cut himself off from something essential. For the first time in 15 years, Everett Pierce allowed himself to wonder what else he might have been wrong about. Silent gestures. Dawn broke over Seattle in pastel watercolors, painting the skyline in gentle pinks and golds. Everett stood at his penthouse window, coffee untouched, watching the city awaken. He hadn't slept well. Images of Nora and Josephine kept surfacing in his mind, disrupting the ordered patterns of his thoughts. His phone chimed with an incoming email. Dr. Harlow from Golden Years Memory Care, responding to his inquiry from the previous night. Her detailed explanation of the experimental treatment program included research papers, success metrics, and, most importantly, the financial structure. The numbers were staggering: $45,000 per month, with a minimum 6-month commitment for the intensive protocol. Insurance covered none of it. Everett did the mental calculation. An assistant's salary, even his generous one, couldn't possibly cover such expenses. Nora must have depleted any savings long ago. The past due notice he'd glimpsed made perfect sense now. An impossible financial burden carried silently, day after day, while she managed his empire without complaint. He opened his laptop and began researching memory care studies, neural regeneration therapies, and the specific protocol Josephine was receiving. 3 hours later, he understood enough to make the calls he needed to make. When Nora arrived at 9, later than usual, though she'd emailed to inform him she had a morning appointment at the care facility, Everett was already deep in negotiations with a biotech firm in Switzerland. Good morning, Mr. Pierce, she said, setting his preferred breakfast on his desk, steel-cut oatmeal with berries and black coffee. I've prepared the follow-up communications for the investors. The Parker Group has already requested another meeting. Thank you, he said, then hesitated. How is your grandmother today? Surprise flickered across Nora's face at the personal inquiry. She's better. The doctors are optimistic about her response to the adjusted protocol. Everett nodded, noting the careful way she separated her personal concerns from their professional relationship. He'd done the same for years, believing it created necessary boundaries. Now he wondered if they were both simply hiding behind those boundaries. I may need your help with a special project, he said, returning to familiar territory. I'm looking into biotech investments, specifically neural regeneration therapies. Nora's expression remained professionally neutral, but her eyes sharpened with interest. Of course. Any specific areas you'd like me to research? Alzheimer's treatments, experimental protocols. I want to understand the market potential. The excuse sounded plausible enough, though Everett felt strangely uncomfortable with the partial truth. Over the next 2 weeks, Everett immersed himself in understanding memory care treatments. He scheduled meetings with researchers, invested in 3 promising biotech startups, and established a foundation focused on making experimental treatments accessible to patients who couldn't afford them. Each step was logical, defensible as a business decision. Expanding Pierce Technologies into healthcare technology was a sound diversification strategy. Yet beneath the rational explanations lay a truth he wasn't ready to acknowledge. Every action was taken with Nora and Josephine in mind. On a rain-soaked Thursday, Everett found himself in a conference room at Seattle General Hospital, meeting with Dr. Eleanor West, the nation's leading researcher in neural regeneration. "Your foundation's approach is unique, Mr. Pierce," Dr. West said, reviewing his proposal. "Most philanthropists want their names on buildings. You're proposing anonymous funding for individual patients who meet specific criteria." "Buildings don't interest me," Everett replied. "Results do. I want to see real-world applications of the research, especially for patients who would otherwise fall through the cracks." "Like the Golden Years Protocol," Dr. West nodded. "Brilliant work, but prohibitively expensive. Your funding could change that for select patients." "How quickly could the foundation begin accepting applications?" "With your resources? Immediately. We could have the first 5 patients fully funded by next week." That evening, Everett had his legal team finalize the foundation's structure, with specific parameters for patient eligibility, parameters that would make Josephine Winters an ideal candidate. He established the selection committee with trusted doctors who understood his vision, then removed himself entirely from the approval process. The anonymity was essential. This wasn't about recognition or gratitude. 3 days later, Dr. Harlow contacted Josephine and Nora with unexpected news. Josephine had been selected for a fully funded continuation of her treatment through a new foundation supporting promising candidates in experimental protocols. All medical expenses would be covered, including retroactive payment of outstanding balances. Everett learned of the approval when he overheard Nora on the phone in her office, her voice breaking with emotion as she confirmed details with the care facility. When she emerged, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her smile was radiant. "Good news?" he asked, pretending ignorance. "Yes," she said simply, the weight of months visibly lifting from her shoulders. "Very good news." That night, Everett found himself standing at his penthouse window again, watching rain trace silver patterns against the glass. For the first time in years, he felt something that might be contentment, an unfamiliar lightness in his chest. He hadn't realized how heavy detachment had become, how exhausting it was to maintain the walls he'd built around himself. The following weeks brought subtle changes to their working relationship. Nora seemed more relaxed, the constant tension in her shoulders easing. Sometimes he caught her humming softly while organizing files, small, unconscious expressions of relief. She began bringing fresh flowers for her desk, and occasionally, for his. "Living things improve cognitive function," she explained with a small smile when she placed a potted orchid in his office, echoing her grandmother's words. Everett found himself looking forward to their morning briefings, to the quiet competence with which she managed his day, to the increasingly comfortable silences that fell between them when they worked late. Sometimes, she would share small updates about Josephine's progress, and he would listen with an interest that surprised him. He began making other changes too, small, private adjustments to the fortress he'd built around his life. He accepted dinner invitations he would have declined before. He reconnected with a cousin he hadn't spoken to in years. He found himself noticing details he'd previously overlooked, the particular quality of morning light on the sound, the satisfaction of helping a struggling intern grasp a complex concept, the simple pleasure of a well-prepared meal shared with someone whose company he enjoyed. One evening, working late on acquisition proposals, Everett looked up to find Nora watching him with a thoughtful expression. "Is something wrong?" he asked. "No," she said, then hesitated. "I'm just grateful for this job, the flexibility, everything." She paused. "My grandmother asked about you yesterday." She remembered you from the celebration. Something warm unfurled in Everett's chest at the thought of being remembered, of mattering in someone's life beyond what he could provide professionally. How is she doing? Better every week, Nora said, her eyes soft. The doctors are calling it remarkable progress. I'm glad, he said simply, meaning it more than she could know. Later that week, Everett found himself driving to Golden Years again, this time intentionally. He told himself it was to observe the results of his foundation's investment, to gather data for future funding decisions. But the truth was simpler and more complex. He wanted to see Josephine again, to witness the improvement in her condition, to be part of, however peripherally, the joy that had lightened Nora's steps. The facility welcomed him as a valued philanthropist now, though his connection to the foundation remained confidential. Dr. Harlow gave him a tour of the treatment, areas explaining protocols and outcomes with professional enthusiasm. And Mrs. Winters? He asked casually. I met her at the celebration. She made quite an impression. Josephine is our star, Dr. Harlow beamed. In fact, she's in the garden now with her art therapy group. Would you like to observe? The garden was a tranquil space filled with raised beds of herbs and flowers. Josephine sat at a table with several other patients, painting watercolors with focused attention. Her brush moved with confident strokes across the paper, creating a landscape that captured the essence of the garden with surprising skill. Mr. Pierce, she called when she spotted him. Come see what I've created. He approached, struck by the clarity in her eyes, so different from the veiled confusion he'd observed in other patients. It's beautiful, he said, genuinely impressed by the painting. I was an art teacher before retirement, she explained. For years I couldn't remember how to hold a brush. Now, it's coming back. She studied him with unexpected perception. You're different than I expected. Oh? He asked, unsure how to respond. Nora described you as brilliant but distant, reserved, she said. But your eyes are kind. Josephine tilted her head. You hide it well, but it's there. Everett felt strangely exposed under her gaze, as if she could see through the carefully constructed persona he presented to the world. Nora works too hard, Josephine continued. Always has. Takes after her father that way. My son was brilliant too, but forgot to live while he was building his career. Her expression softened with old grief. Before the accident took them, both my last words to him were to remember that success is empty without someone to share it with. The words struck Everett with uncomfortable precision, as if she had somehow seen into the hollow spaces of his carefully constructed life. The foundation that's helping you, he said, changing the subject. It's making a difference? More than you know, Josephine replied, her eyes twinkling with something that might have been knowing amusement. It's given Nora her life back. And me? Well, it's given me my mind back. There's no greater gift than that. As Everett drove home that evening, Josephine's words echoed in his thoughts. Success is empty without someone to share it with. For 15 years, he'd built an empire on the premise that connection was vulnerability, that isolation was strength. Yet in the quiet honesty of his thoughts, he could no longer deny the emptiness that had grown alongside his success. An emptiness that had begun to fill, almost imperceptibly since Nora Winters had walked into his office with her quiet competence and hidden depths. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. Somewhere along the way, his carefully constructed solitude had become a prison rather than a fortress, and now, without quite intending it, he had begun to build a door. Thawing frost autumn painted Seattle in amber and crimson, the morning fog lingering over the sound like a reluctant goodbye to summer. Everett sat in his office reviewing the quarterly reports with an attention that kept drifting. Pierce Technologies had exceeded all projections. The biotech division was thriving, and the foundation had already funded treatment for 12 patients with remarkable results. By every measurable metric, this should have been a moment of satisfaction. Yet something restless had taken root in him, a growing awareness that success felt different now, more textured and complex than the cold achievement he'd once pursued. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Pierce, your 10 o'clock is here. Send them in," he replied, expecting the venture capital team scheduled to discuss Asian market expansion. Instead, Nora walked in, closed the door behind her, and placed a folder on his desk with deliberate care. Her expression was composed but determined, her posture straight as always, though something in her eyes suggested she was bracing herself. "This isn't the venture capital team," he observed. "No," she agreed. "They've been rescheduled for tomorrow. I needed to speak with you privately." Everett felt a flicker of concern. "Is everything all right with Josephine?" "She's flourishing." A brief smile softened Nora's features before she gestured to the folder. "This is why I needed to speak with you." He opened it to find documents from Golden Years Memory Care, payment records, foundation approval letters, and a private investigator's report connecting Everett to the foundation that had mysteriously saved Josephine's treatment program. "You've been busy," he said quietly, closing the folder. "So have you." Nora's voice held no accusation, only a question. "Why did you do it?" Everett rose and walked to the window, buying time as he organized thoughts that refused to align into the neat, logical patterns he preferred. The truth was, he wasn't entirely sure himself why he'd created the foundation, why he'd structured it specifically to help Josephine, why he'd kept his involvement secret. "The experimental protocol showed promise," he finally said. "Supporting medical advancement is good business. Is that all it was?" "Business?" Nora asked, moving to stand beside him at the window. "The foundation's parameters match my grandmother's situation exactly. The timing, the retroactive payment of outstanding balances, it was all designed for her, wasn't it?" Everett turned to face her, finding unexpected courage in her steady gaze. "Yes." The simple admission hung between them, disrupting the careful, professional boundaries they'd maintained for months. Nora studied him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not gratitude, not confusion, but something more complex. "Why the secrecy?" she asked. "Why not tell me?" "I didn't want you to feel obligated." The word felt inadequate. "Your work here has always stood on its own merit. This was separate." "Nothing is ever truly separate," Nora said softly. "You've changed these past months. So have you." She smiled at that. "Yes. It's easier to breathe when you're not drowning." A companionable silence fell between them as they looked out at the city below, the space between them charged with unspoken possibilities. "I've given my notice at Golden Years," Nora said eventually. "Grandma is being transferred to a residential program for recovering patients. She'll have her own apartment with support staff but real independence. The doctors say her recovery has been remarkable." "That's wonderful news," Everett said, genuinely pleased. "She asked about you last week." Nora turned to face him fully. "She said I should invite you to dinner, to thank you properly." "That's not necessary." "It's not about necessity." Her voice was gentle but firm. "Some things are about connection, not obligation. That's what I've been trying to understand about you, Everett. Why someone who built walls so high would suddenly create a door." The use of his first name, rare outside the office, felt significant. Everett found himself facing a crossroads he'd avoided for 15 years. The choice between safe isolation and the risk of genuine connection. "I believed for a long time that vulnerability was weakness," he said carefully. "That attachments were liabilities. I built Pierce Technologies on that premise. And now? Now I'm less certain." He met her eyes. "Watching you with Josephine, I saw strength in your connection, not weakness. It made me question whether I've been wrong all these years." Nora's expression softened. "The strongest structures aren't rigid, you know. They bend, they adapt, they connect to other structures. That's basic engineering. I'm more familiar with emotional demolition than construction," he admitted with unexpected honesty. She laughed, a warm sound he'd grown to appreciate. "Well, you seem to be learning. The foundation wasn't just about money, it was about understanding what matters." Perhaps. He hesitated, then added, I would like to meet Josephine in her new home if the invitation still stands. It does. Nora's smile reached her eyes, creating fine lines at the corners that he found surprisingly captivating. Sunday at 6, she's making her famous pot roast. I'll bring wine. Red. She's particular about that. When Sunday arrived, Everett found himself driving to a modern apartment complex in Ballard, a bottle of carefully selected Cabernet on the passenger seat. The building was designed for seniors transitioning back to independent living. Elegant without being institutional, supportive without being restrictive. Josephine's apartment was on the 3rd floor, bright and airy with large windows overlooking a courtyard garden. When she opened the door, he was struck by the transformation since he'd first met her. Her silver hair was styled in a sleek bob, her posture straight, her eyes clear and alert. Right on time, she declared approvingly. Punctuality suggests respect for other people's time. Come in, come in. The apartment smelled of rosemary and garlic, the table set with obvious care, 3 places with linen napkins and what appeared to be hand-painted plates. I made those, Josephine said, following his gaze to the plates. Art therapy became a passion. Now I teach a class twice weekly for the other residents. They're beautiful, he said, meaning it. Nora will be here shortly, Josephine continued, taking the wine with appreciative nods. She's bringing dessert. That girl never arrives anywhere empty-handed, too responsible for her own good. Rather like you, I suspect. Before Everett could respond, she fixed him with a perceptive gaze that reminded him of their conversation in the garden. I know about the foundation, she said directly. Nora tried to keep it from me, but I'm recovering my memory, not my intelligence. It was you all along, wasn't it? The selection committee made the decisions, he hedged, after you created the parameters. Josephine waved away his attempt at modesty. I've lived long enough to recognize when someone is hiding their light. The question is why? Why help us and why hide it? Everett considered deflecting again, but something about Josephine's straightforward manner invited honesty. I admired how Nora carried her burden, he said finally. With grace, without complaint. I wanted to help, but not complicate our professional relationship. Ah. Josephine's eyes twinkled knowingly. And has it remained uncomplicated? Before he could answer, the door opened and Nora entered, carrying a bakery box and looking different than he'd ever seen her. Relaxed in jeans and a soft blue sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders, a hint of color in her cheeks from the autumn chill. Sorry I'm late, she said, setting down the box to embrace her grandmother. The bakery was crowded. Worth waiting for, I'm sure, Josephine said, then added with suspicious innocence. I was just asking Everett about his foundation. Nora shot him an apologetic glance. Grandma, we agreed. You agreed, Josephine corrected mildly. I merely nodded politely while planning to ask anyway. Dinner was a revelation for Everett. The easy conversation, the warm laughter, the simple pleasure of sharing a meal. These were experiences he'd forgotten or perhaps never truly known. Josephine regaled them with stories from her teaching days, her memories now vibrant and connected where once they had been fragmented. Later, when Josephine excused herself to rest, the doctor says not to overdo it, though I feel perfectly fine. Nora and Everett found themselves alone on the small balcony watching stars appear in the clear autumn sky. Thank you for coming, Nora said, her voice soft in the gathering darkness. It meant a lot to her, to both of us. I enjoyed it, Everett replied, surprised by the simple truth of it. Your grandmother is remarkable. She likes you, says you. Remind her of my grandfather, brilliant but hiding a good heart behind a serious exterior. High praise, Everett murmured, aware of Nora's proximity, of the subtle scent of her perfume on the cool evening air. The highest, she agreed. He was the love of her life. A comfortable silence fell between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Everett found himself at another crossroads, the safety of professional distance on one side, the risk of genuine connection on the other. "I've been thinking about your resignation," he said finally. Nora looked up, startled. "I haven't resigned." "From Golden Years," he clarified. "You mentioned transitioning Josephine to the new program." "Oh." She smiled, relief evident. "Yes, it's strange not going there every evening. I've had actual free time for the first time in years." "And how are you? Spending it?" "Remembering who I am beyond crisis management," she said thoughtfully. "I started painting again, Grandma's influence, and I've been considering new professional challenges." Everett felt an unexpected tightness in his chest at the thought of her seeking opportunities elsewhere. At Pierce Technologies? Perhaps. She turned to face him fully. "That depends on whether certain complications would make it impossible." The word hung between them, echoing their earlier conversation. Complications, the careful boundaries between professional and personal, between employer and employee, between two people who had begun to see each other beyond their carefully constructed facades. "I've been considering restructuring the executive team," Everett said carefully. "Creating a new position, Chief Operations Officer, someone who understands both the technical and human elements of the company, someone with vision and compassion." "An interesting combination," Nora observed, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "And would this position report directly to you?" "Initially, though it would have considerable autonomy." "And these complications we mentioned?" Everett took a breath, then stepped into unfamiliar territory with unexpected certainty. "I've learned recently that some complications are worth navigating. That connection isn't always a liability." Nora's smile deepened. "That sounds suspiciously like growth, Mr. Pierce." "Everett," he corrected gently. "At least outside the office." "Everett," she agreed, her voice warming the syllables. "And what if these complications extend beyond professional boundaries?" Thought of Josephine's words, "Success is empty without someone to share it with," and of the hollow spaces in his carefully constructed life that had begun to fill since Nora had entered it. "Then we navigate those too," he said simply. "One step at a time." Nora's hand found his on the balcony railing, her fingers cool against his palm. "I'd like that." Above them, stars continued their ancient patterns across the autumn sky. Below, the city pulsed with life and possibility. And between them, something new and fragile and strong began to take shape. A bridge across the careful distance they had both maintained for different reasons, leading toward a future neither had anticipated. Later, driving home through Seattle's quiet streets, Everett realized that for the first time in 15 years, his penthouse wouldn't feel empty when he returned to it. Not because anything had physically changed, but because he carried something with him now that he hadn't before. The warmth of connection, the promise of possibility, the understanding that true strength wasn't found in isolation, but in the courage to reach across the distances we create. The frost that had preserved and protected him for so long was finally thawing, revealing something unexpected beneath. Not the vulnerability he had feared, but a capacity for joy he had forgotten existed. And as the skyline came into view, glittering against the night sky, Everett Pierce found himself looking forward to tomorrow in a way he never had before. Not for the acquisitions or achievements that awaited, but for the simple pleasure of seeing Nora's smile when he asked her, officially, to consider the new position, and perhaps eventually, to consider something more.